In the 3 weeks since the Long Beach race, the 55th Academy Awards had seen Gandhi clean up, winning 8 Oscars including Best Picture, Best Director for Richard Attenborough, and Best Actor for Ben Kingsley, while E.T. the Extraterrestrial won 4, including Sound Design and Special Effects. David Bowie released his first album on his new EMI label, Let's Dance, which saw a change of musical direction into a more commercial dance, pop, rock sound. It brought huge success and remains his best-selling album, though he later felt it represented a creative low point, the beginning of what he termed his Phil Collins period. The second NASA Space Shuttle, Challenger, made its maiden flight, during which the first shuttle-launched spacewalk occurred as the 4-man crew put a satellite in orbit. Easter weekend in Britain saw the debut on morning television show TV-AM of Roland Rat, drafted in to entertain younger viewers and introduce cartoons during the school holidays. The puppet character proved immensely popular and is created with single-handedly saving TV-AM, whose ratings have been flagging for some time. Over in the US, cable subscribers were now able to receive the Disney Channel for the first time, which launched on the day of the French Grand Prix. The first programme shown on the new channel was Good Morning Mickey, a compilation of reruns of Mickey Mouse and other Disney cartoons from the 1930s to 50s. And the Five Nations Championship in Rugby Union ended in a tie, with France and Ireland finishing level on points. With tie-breaks not introduced until 1993, it was the 17th championship to be tied. The last occasion had been in 1973, when all 5 teams had won 2 and lost 2 and finished in a 5-way tie. With the turnout at last year's French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard being disappointing, despite the attraction of a bevy of top-line French drivers and cars, the owners of the circuit wondered if part of the problem had been the close proximity of the French and Swiss races, with the latter held at the more easily accessible Dijon circuit. To try and remedy this, the Paul Ricard race was moved to an unfamiliarly early April date and would kick off the European season. Jean-Louis Schlesser was making his championship debut in the second March after his debut at the Race of Champions, and Chico Serra was back in the second Arrows after Alan Jones failed to attract any sponsorship.
Well, the team are having a little bit of difficulty obtaining the sponsorship they require to run the cars and to develop and test them and to run me.
Does that mean to say that you are not going to make a Grand Prix comeback now?
Well, it very much depends on a few considerations. It's no point, I mean, at the moment I would be too much of a financial drain on the team just for having me in there. I think it's more important that they get the money to develop and test the car to make it competitive, and then get me, you know.
Well, now that you've driven the new specification cars without skirts, what do you think of them in comparison with the ones you drove when you were world champion and after?
Well, they're a lot more comfortable because they have suspension and a bit more feel. I mean, the commitment into the corners isn't as great as a skirted car. The cars do slide around a bit more, and I think that makes it a bit more enjoyable.
Easier to drive?
No, I wouldn't say easier to drive. Easier on the driver in terms of comfort, but maybe, if anything, a little bit harder in terms of car control.
The Australian had travelled south anyway, driving gear with him, in case any last-minute opportunity presented itself. So those teams and drivers who'd spent the previous weekend at Brands joined the rest at the rather featureless plateau near Le Castellet between Toulon and Marseille in the south of France. Local Wild West-themed amusement park the OK Corral did at least provide some sponsorship on the plain white Arrows. There were a few developments on the car front. Renault now had a new RE40 chassis for both drivers, while Lotus had 2 Renault-powered cars for De Angelis and 2 for Mansell with the new Ford Cosworth DFY engine. McLaren had 2 of the new DFY units too, which they would use during practice and see if they wanted to risk them in the race. The Lotus team had also removed the computer-controlled suspension from Nigel's car, which hadn't proved enough of an advantage to offset the extra weight. More work needed there. Once again, refuelling would be a gamble here with an epically long pit lane, which in turn meant a risky pit exit, with cars leaving the pits doing some 130 miles an hour by the time they rejoined the track proper. Even so, many of the teams had installed new quick-action filler caps to speed things along. The weather was perfect, the sun out but tempered by a cool breeze, and perhaps inevitably the turbo cars dominated, and none more so than Alain Prost, who took pole position by a massive 2.3 seconds over his teammate Eddie Cheever, making his first front-row start. Then came Patrese and Arnoux, then De Angelis and Piquet. Andrea de Cesaris's Saturday time was good enough for pole, but it was disallowed when scrutineering found that he'd been running with an empty fire extinguisher, and thus 5 kilos underweight, and he lined up 7th alongside his teammate Baldi. With Warwick, Winkelhock and Tombe 11th after a series of niggling car problems, Niki Lauda was the top normally aspirated car back in 12th, with Watson 14th, Alboreto 15th and champion Rosberg 16th, nearly 6 seconds adrift. Sullivan could only manage 24th after his Brands Hatch heroics, and both Ram drivers and Ghinzani would be the 3 missing out on Sunday. Over the course of Friday and Saturday, the Ferraris had blown 8 engines between them, so they had a lot of work to do before the race. Sunday was grey and overcast, but still fairly warm, and a reasonable but not spectacular crowd of 30,000 was there to see what promised to be a good day for the Renaults. Tombe was having turbocharger problems and decided to start in the spare, as did Patrese over at Brabham. The Italian would celebrate his 29th birthday on race day. McLaren and Lotus decided to run their new DFY engines in the race in the probably vain hope of staying in touch with the turbos. As the cars were departing the pit lane, there was an odd accident in the Lotus pit when the mechanics accidentally ran Nigel Mansell's left foot over while pushing the car. In severe pain, Nigel hopped into the cockpit and hoped the adrenaline would carry him through. With no further dramas, they lined up for the start and off they went, with Patrese getting ahead of Cheever into the first corner and Piquet also starting well and taking 4th, with the 2 Ferraris behind. Then came De Angelis and Warwick, with Rosberg leaping from 16th to 9th in about half a lap. Further back, Watson had rear-ended Baldi, and both came into the pits for a new nose and a new set of tyres, respectively. Prost was soon drawing away in the lead, while Cheever got back ahead of Patrese on lap 2, and Tombe had got ahead of his teammate to go 5th in the Ferrari. Prost was going about a second a lap faster than Cheever, and as the initial laps went on, the most interest on track was a fine scrap between De Angelis and Rosberg, with the Williams driver attacking the Turbo Lotus and finally managing to make a move stick before advancing on Arnoux' 6th-placed Ferrari, and going past on lap 9. However, he was in no real danger of catching Prost, who continued to stretch his lead. Watson's new nose cone was rendered moot after just 3 laps when his Ford DFY expired, and Mansell only lasted another couple of laps before retiring due to the pain from his foot. Once more, things at the front had settled down, with the front runners seemingly waiting to see how the pit stop situation shook out. But there was an entertaining battle further down, as Winkelhock in 9th led De Cesaris, De Angelis, who was suffering with his tyres already, Lafitte and Lauda. The second Williams got past the ailing Lotus, but Lauda couldn't find an opening, and was soon under threat from Alboreto. His problem was the same that the Williams boys had had. The lighter Atmo car was faster through the corners, and Lauda could get past, but then De Angelis simply motored back past on the mile-long Mistral straight. The others had managed it by getting past early enough in the lap that they'd had a bit of daylight and could hang on, but Lauda just couldn't seem to manage it somehow. Derek Warwick made it 3 British retirements on lap 16 when his Hart engine let go. Then on lap 19, Patrese toured in to retire with a water leak, while his teammate Piquet had inveigled his way past Cheever and was therefore up to 2nd. So on lap 20, approaching half distance, the order was Prost, Piquet, Cheever, Tombe, Rosberg, Arnoux and Lafitte. De Cesaris then led Winkelhock, followed by the Lauda De Angelis Alboreto scrap. Niki had finally made it past the Lotus when an electrical glitch saw Elio's front right lock up badly. He got it moving again, but only in order to trail back round to the pits and retire. Arnoux was the first in for a fuel stop on lap 24, having just lost 6th to Lafitte, and Cheever followed him in shortly afterwards. Both clean stops, though the Renault boys were slightly slower. Rosberg came in himself, only for something to go wrong on the front wheels and lose him time in the pits, and then a lap later it was Prost's turn. Again, a problem meant that he was stationary for over 24 seconds and lost the lead to Piquet. Nelson had yet to stop, but if the Brabham team could do a good job, he shouldn't be too far behind when he did. Brabham came in on lap 32. The team got to work, and the car was stationary for just over 16 seconds, putting him back out in second, around 8 seconds behind Prost. 8 seconds became 10, then 14, and it was quickly obvious that unless something broke on the leading Renault, it was all over as a contest. Piquet, in fact, had to worry more about Cheever behind than Prost ahead. Alain Prost took his 6th Grand Prix win and his first points finish of 1983 in totally dominant style, almost 30 seconds ahead of Piquet, who was in turn 10 seconds ahead of third-place Cheever. Patrick Tambay was the only other driver on the lead lap, over a minute adrift, and Rosberg and Lafitte picked up the remaining points for Williams, having both kept an unhappy Arnoux behind them. With Lauda having retired on lap 30 with a wheel bearing failure, Piquet took over the championship lead. Once again, Renault had come good on home tarmac after a troubled start to the season. Next up was the San Marino race at Imola in 2 weeks' time, in which Ferrari would be hoping to do the same.